Service accounts have been one of those unfortunate necessary evils with the Windows operating system since its inception. They are perhaps an unintended consequence of the security model that Microsoft put into place for the OS. Now, a service account in this context just essentially means a user account that isn't directly attributed to a human being. A service account here is one that you create for some application or service, classically, to run and execute under a certain context. And the biggest problem with service accounts is that exact lack of any kind of attribution to a human being that can be there when things like a password reset are required. Because of the way Windows has operated, both in the past and now, it wasn't really easy to identify when those service accounts may, for example, require their passwords to be changed. And so all too often what happens is the password comes up for renewal, no human being is there to see the message, and the service account just simply no longer functions. Now, in the past, a lot of us got around this problem by configuring the password does not expire property on that user account associated with each service. But that's not something that really works from a security perspective. It may have solved the problem, but it did so by reducing the security posture for each account that we used. And so Microsoft has, in recent OS versions, attempted to try to temper some of these service problems, these service account problems, by incorporating new technologies into the operating system that can ease their use. Here in this module, we'll talk about just the variety of ways in which service accounts can be dealt with, mainly dealing with the authentication of those accounts to the domain. Now, this has to do with the configuration of passwords. We'll actually take a look at a service account and how you can configure a password on a service account. I assume you've probably done this in the past. We'll take a look also at some special kinds of technologies that Microsoft has recently brought to bear, which can help with that need to reset the password on an account that doesn't have a human being associated. One such technology is called Group Managed Service Accounts, which are a second generation of another technology called Managed Service Accounts that Microsoft released in a previous OS version that was a great idea on paper, but didn't really work in practice. Microsoft also has a third approach you can use called virtual accounts, which are far less exciting than their name might have you believe. A virtual account is essentially the use of the service name as the service account on the local machine. And so when you make this configuration, essentially the local machine ends up managing those password changes on your behalf. Virtual accounts might seem like a great solution, but they only work when the application only has need to access resources on that local machine, so their use is relatively limited. We also need to talk about when you configure an account, so an actual user account in Active Directory, to be able to perform things on behalf of the server where they're used, as well as on other machines as well. We have to have this notion of the handoff of those credentials so that that delegation of authentication will work. Well, with Kerberos, we have the ability to configure Kerberos delegation on an account. Now, for a lot of years, this functionality wasn't used all that often, but lately you're starting to see even Microsoft making use of Kerberos constrained delegation as a mechanism to facilitate this spread of user privileges from one machine to another. So we'll talk about how you would do that on a user account. It's just a couple of clicks and an additional tab that you'll find in Active Directory Users and Computers. The last of these topics is the one that's probably the most confusing, and it's one I would definitely stick around for because service principal names provide a mechanism for you to directly address an instance of a service on a machine. Now, perhaps the best metaphor for this is something you may have seen already in SQL Server. If you've ever installed SQL Server, you know you can install it through the default instance, or you can install a named instance of SQL Server. And the whole point being that that instance of SQL Server is an independently running instance of that application that can be directly addressed, which does different things, contains different data, is responsible for a different mission. Well, a service principal name presents the ability to accomplish that for any service that you can attribute. The idea here being that when you create a service principal name, you are then logging that instance globally so that other machines can access not only the service, but the specific instance of the service on that machine. SPNs are a bit complicated, and admittedly, even I have trouble sometimes figuring out exactly what the command structure is for the set SPN command that we'll use to configure them. So stick around for this last task here, and I'll give you a good explanation of what they are and when you might use them.